When the icy black water pulls you under, your past does not flash before your eyes. Only the bitter regrets of the things you never wanted. For Elias, a 25-year-old rancher stripped of his birthright, the ocean rushing into his lungs felt like a fitting end to a life that had already been stolen from him. The ship was tearing itself apart on a hidden reef, the agonizing shriek of splintering oak drowning out the screams of the crew. Elias was thrown violently into the pitch-black sea, tumbling through a chaos of churning foam, shattered timber, and drowning men. He fought the current not out of a desire to live, but out of pure, blind animal instinct. When his battered body finally washed up on a stretch of coarse, freezing sand, he collapsed. He lay there in the dark, coughing up seawater, shivering uncontrollably, and waiting for the morning sun to reveal the extent of his nightmare. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a sun-baked purgatory. It was a barren spit of volcanic rock and blinding white sand, entirely devoid of trees, fresh water, or hope. But the most jarring sight was not the desolate landscape, nor the wreckage of the ship scattered along the reef. It was the figure sitting quietly on a half-buried wooden crate, wringing out the hem of her heavy woolen dress. It was Clara. She was 52 years old, the former head maid of his family's estate, and the very reason Elias had been on that doomed ship in the first place. To understand the bitter irony of their survival, you have to understand the disgrace that put them there. Elias had been the arrogant heir to a massive cattle empire, until his father's catastrophic gambling debts brought the family to ruin. To save face and liquidate the remaining assets, Elias' father brokered a humiliating deal with their creditors. Elias was to be stripped of his name, exiled to the remote colonies, and forced into an arranged marriage to ensure he could never return to claim his inheritance. The bride they chose was Clara. She was a quiet, unassuming woman who had spent 30 years scrubbing their floors. A woman who knew all the family's darkest secrets and was paid a modest sum to take the disgraced son far away. For Elias, she was a walking monument to his failure. He had spent the entire 3-month voyage refusing to speak to her, hating her for the age in her face, the roughness of her hands, and the constant reminder of his own shattered pride. Now they were the only two left alive. The first 3 days on the island were a masterclass in human deterioration. The equatorial sun was a white-hot hammer. Elias, utterly broken by the loss of his old life and the sheer impossibility of their situation, simply gave up. He retreated into the meager shade of a rocky overhang, his lips cracking, his skin blistering, waiting for death to claim him. He believed that survival was a mathematical equation, and without fresh water, the math said they were already dead. But Clara did not know how to give up. She had spent a lifetime being invisible, enduring the grueling, endless labor of serving others. To her, this barren rock was just another hard floor to scrub, another impossible task demanded of her by a cruel world. She did not panic, she did not weep. While Elias surrendered to despair, Clara went to work on the morning of the 3rd day. Elias woke to the agonizing sensation of a swollen tongue and a throat like dry paper. He opened his bloodshot eyes to see Clara kneeling beside him. In her scarred, calloused hands, she held a large, curved oyster shell. Inside was a mouthful of fresh, clear water. She tipped it past his cracked lips. It was the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. When Elias finally found the strength to sit up, he saw what she had done. Clara had scavenged a large piece of oiled canvas from the wreckage and stretched it over a pit she had dug in the damp sand near the high tide lines. She had placed a smooth stone in the center of the canvas, creating a dip. As the relentless sun baked the wet sand, the moisture evaporated, hit the underside of the canvas, condensed, and dripped perfectly into a tin cup she had salvaged. It was a rudimentary solar still. She had built 3 of them. She had saved his life. Elias looked at the woman he had been forced to marry. Her face was weathered, her graying hair tangled with salt and sand, but as she watched him drink, a slow, gentle smile spread across her face. It was a smile that held absolutely no resentment for the boy who had treated her like garbage. It was a smile of pure, resilient hope. In that singular moment, the bitter, arrogant rancher died, and a desperate survivor was born. From that day forward, the dynamic shifted, the artificial boundaries of class, age, and forced marriage dissolved into the harsh reality of the island. They became partners. Elias slowly regained his strength and began to apply the skills he had learned on the ranch to their new, unforgiving world. He knew how to read the weather, how to tie unbreakable knots, and how to build. He waded out to the jagged reef at low tide, dragging back heavy, waterlogged timbers from the ship's shattered hull. Using fibrous roots pulled from the sparse, thorny scrub brush that clung to the rocks, he braided thick, sturdy ropes. Together, they hauled the timbers up the beach and wedged them into a natural fissure in the basalt cliffs, constructing a heavy, windproof shelter that could withstand the violent coastal squalls. Clara used a sharpened piece of metal to carefully unravel the ship's remaining rigging, weaving the fine threads into a sprawling, intricate casting net. While Elias hunted seabirds with stones, Clara waded into the treacherous, razor-sharp coral pools, her skirts tied up around her waist, ignoring the bleeding cuts on her legs to harvest limpets, sea urchins, and rock crabs. Weeks bled into months, and a strange, profound transformation began to take place. The island, which had initially been a death sentence, slowly became a sanctuary. Out here, Elias was not a disgraced son or a failure. He was a provider, a builder, a man who worked with his hands and saw the immediate, life-saving results of his labor. And Clara was no longer a servant. For the first time in her life, she was deeply valued, she was listened to, she was an equal. As the first year drew to a close, Elias found himself watching her. He noticed the quiet grace in the way she moved, the brilliant resourcefulness of her mind, and the comforting warmth of her presence by the fire each night. They would sit under a canopy of blazing, unpolluted stars, listening to the roar of the ocean, and they would talk. They talked about the fears they had hidden, the loneliness of their past lives, and the strange peace they had found on this desolate rock. Elias realized that the woman sitting across from him was the strongest human being he had ever known. The age difference between them became entirely irrelevant. He fell deeply, irreversibly in love with her. When he finally took her scarred hands in his and confessed his feelings, Clara wept. They were tears of disbelief, followed by a profound, overwhelming joy. The arranged marriage that had been intended as a cruel punishment had blossomed into the truest, most genuine bond either of them had ever experienced. They were no longer exiles waiting to be rescued. They were the king and queen of an island fortress they had built with their own hands. But isolation does strange things to the human mind, and survival is rarely without its shadows. As they entered their second year on the island, Elias began to notice a subtle, unsettling shift in Clara's behavior. It started as a faint undercurrent of unease. Clara had always been meticulous about their routines. She became fiercely, almost obsessively protective of a small, hidden sea cave on the extreme eastern edge of the island. It was a treacherous spot, accessible only by navigating a narrow ledge above the crashing surf. Clara claimed the cave was naturally cooler and perfect for drying and storing the strips of salted fish they relied on during the stormy season. Elias saw no reason to doubt her. But then he started noticing the inconsistencies. Clara would spend hours in the eastern cave, long after the fish had been turned and salted. Whenever Elias offered to go in her place to save her the difficult climb, she would quickly, almost nervously, decline, insisting that the climb kept her legs strong. Then came the issue of the signal fire. During their first few months, they had carefully maintained a massive pile of dry brush and driftwood on the highest point of the island, ready to be lit the moment a sail appeared on the horizon. But as their second year stretched on, Clara stopped gathering kindling for it. When the heavy monsoon rains washed the pile away, she never suggested rebuilding it. When Elias brought it up, she brushed it off, saying the damp wood would never catch anywhere, and that their time was better spent reinforcing the shelter. Elias ignored his growing suspicions, burying them beneath his love for her. But a seed of doubt had been planted. And on a sweltering afternoon in the middle of their third year, that seed violently took root. A sudden, massive tropical depression had formed off the coast. bringing howling winds and horizontal rain that threatened to rip their shelter apart. Clara was down by the lagoon, desperately tying down their fishing nets. Elias realized the wind was tearing at the heavy canvas tarp they used to cover the drying racks in the eastern cave. Fearing they would lose their entire winter food supply, he sprinted across the island, fighting the gale, and scaled the slippery, rain-slicked ledge to the cave. When he threw himself inside the dark cavern, gasping for air, he found the fish racks perfectly secure, but the torrential rain pouring through a fissure in the cave roof had washed away a large pile of loose rocks in the back corner, revealing something that made Elias' blood run cold. It was a heavy, brass-bound wooden chest. He recognized it instantly. It was the captain's waterproof lockbox from their sunken ship. Elias knelt in the damp sand, his heart hammering against his ribs. The brass padlock was thick and heavily rusted, but it had recently been oiled with animal fat. Someone had been opening it. He grabbed a heavy stone from the cave floor and brought it down on the padlock with terrifying force. Once, twice, 3 times until the brass shattered, he threw open the lid. Inside, perfectly dry and carefully wrapped in oilcloths, was the ship's heavy brass flare pistol. Beside it lay a pristine, unfired phosphorus flare. Next to that was the captain's polished brass spyglass. And finally, sitting at the bottom of the chest, was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Elias' hands were shaking as he picked up the book. The first few pages were standard maritime manifests, but halfway through, the neat ink gave way to crude, dark handwriting done in burnt charcoal. It was Clara's handwriting. It was a diary. He turned to the most recent entry, his eyes scanning the smudged words in the dim light of the cave. The date she had marked was over a year ago. It was the exact week Elias had been bedridden with a severe bout of tropical fever, delirious and slipping in and out of consciousness. The entry read, "May God forgive me." The merchant ship passed the outer reef just before dawn. It was a massive whaling vessel. She was close enough that through the glass I could see the men on the deck. I held the flare gun in my hands. I stood on the ridge for an hour, watching her sails fill with wind. But I looked back at the shelter. I looked at Elias sleeping. If I fire the flare, we go back. We go back to a world where he is a disgraced failure, and I am nothing but an ugly, aging joke. He will realize he does not need me. He will leave me. I cannot lose him. I buried the flares in the chest. I let the ship sail away. I have condemned us to this rock. Because it is the only place in the world he looks at me with love. Elias dropped the book. The air was suddenly sucked from his lungs. The roar of the storm outside faded into a high, ringing silence. The woman he loved. The woman he trusted with his life. The woman he had built this entire world with had intentionally kept them marooned. She had played God with his life. She had let rescue slip through their fingers entirely out of her own desperate insecurity. A blinding, white-hot rage erupted in his chest. He grabbed the flare gun and the diary, stormed out of the cave, and marched back across the ridge, the torrential rain masking the tears streaming down his face. He found Clara standing outside the shelter, soaked to the bone, securing the final rope. When she turned and saw Elias standing there, holding the brass pistol and the open book, the color completely drained from her face. She didn't run. She didn't make excuses. She just stood there, the rain plastering her gray hair to her face, trembling as the truth hung between them like a drawn blade. "You let them pass," Elias roared, his voice tearing through the wind. "You let a ship pass us by. We could be home, we could be off this godforsaken rock." Clara fell to her knees in the wet sand. She didn't cry out for forgiveness. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, terrified and heartbreakingly vulnerable. "What home, Elias?" she screamed back, her voice cracking with decades of repressed pain. "What home were we going back to? The one where your father sold you to pay his debts. The one where society laughed at us as we walked down the street. You were a dead man on the mainland. They threw you away. And they threw me away with you." She pointed a trembling finger at the sturdy timber shelter, the massive stone fire pit, the carefully woven nets hanging in the wind. "Look at what we built. Look at who you are now. You are strong, you are proud, and for the first time in 52 years I am not a servant. I am a wife, I am loved. If we went back on that ship, the magic would break. The world would remind you of who I am, and you would hate me again. I chose this island because this island is the only place we actually exist." Elias stood frozen. The heavy brass flare gun gripped so tightly in his hand his knuckles were white. His mind raced with a chaotic storm of betrayal, anger, and staggering realization. He looked at the flare gun. It represented rescue. It represented a return to civilization, to warm beds, to endless food. To the society he had once belonged to, but then he looked at Clara. He looked at the deep scars on her hands from harvesting the coral reefs to keep him fed. He looked at the shelter they had built together. A fortress that was currently withstanding a hurricane. He remembered the arrogant, useless boy he had been on the mainland. A boy who had been perfectly willing to lay down and die in the sand. Clara had not just saved his life, she had forged him into a man. The mainland held nothing for him but shame, debt, and a family that had discarded him like trash. Clara was right, the world out there was a poison. This island, with all its harshness, its brutality, and its isolation, was the only place he had ever known true freedom. Slowly, deliberately, Elias lowered the flare gun. He looked at the brass weapon, then looked out at the churning, violent ocean. With a massive heave, he threw the heavy pistol as far as he could into the breaking waves. It disappeared into the dark water, gone forever. Clara let out a choked, breathless sob. Elias walked over, knelt in the wet sand, and pulled her shivering body into his arms. He held her tightly as the storm raged around them, burying his face in her wet hair. The betrayal was real, the deception was profound, but the love that had driven it was absolute. They had both been castaways long before they ever set foot on the ship. A year later, on their 1095th day on the island, the horizon finally broke. A British naval surveying vessel charting the remote outer reefs spotted the unnatural geometric shape of the timber shelter against the basalt cliffs. They dropped anchor and rowed a longboat through the treacherous surf, expecting to find bleached bones or half-mad savages clinging to life. Instead, the sailors stepped onto the white sand and stopped in absolute awe. Standing before them was not a scene of desperate tragedy, but a thriving, impregnable fortress. The beach was lined with intricate, highly engineered fish traps. A massive stone cistern collected clean rainwater. And standing calmly by the fire pit were Elias and Clara. They were heavily tanned, incredibly lean, and clothed in meticulously woven garments made from canvas and dried fibers. They did not run toward the sailors weeping or begging for salvation. They stood tall, holding hands, projecting a quiet, undeniable authority. They looked like royalty who had simply been waiting for an audience. The commanding officer, stunned by their health and the sheer scale of their survival, approached them cautiously. He removed his hat and asked for their names, assuming Elias had been a passenger and Clara a servant who had somehow survived the wreck. Elias looked at the officer, then looked down at Clara. He squeezed her scarred hand, a fierce, unbreakable pride swelling in his chest. He did not introduce her as his maid. He did not introduce her as his punishment. "My name is Elias," he said, his voice steady and echoing across the quiet beach, "and this is my wife Clara. And we are ready to go home." When they finally returned to civilization, the world tried to separate them. Society expected Elias to cast aside the older woman, to reclaim his family name, and to integrate back into the rigid structures of the life he had lost. But the island had burned away the boy they once knew. Elias refused every pressure, every whisper, and every societal expectation. He bought a small, isolated piece of land far from the cities, where he and Clara lived out the rest of their days in quiet, fiercely loyal devotion. They had faced the absolute limits of human endurance, survived the darkest depths of deception, and built an unshakable empire out of nothing but wreckage and dust. It is a story that forces us to ask ourselves a profound question. Could you forgive the ultimate betrayal if it was born of a desperate, terrified love? Let me know in the comments below. Their story remains one of the most incredible testaments to the psychology of survival, proving that sometimes, to finally get the life you always needed, you have to let the icy black water pull you under.